The air was thick, oppressive, like 1,000 heavy blankets pressing down on the town of Parkersburg. It was the kind of afternoon where you could taste the humidity on your lips, feel it clinging to your skin as if the very air refused to let go. The sun hung low in the sky, a dull, washed-out yellow that seemed to cast an eerie, otherworldly glow over the streets. The wind had slowed to a whisper, like the calm before a storm, but something felt off. There was a stillness, a silence that almost felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. The birds were no longer singing. In the distance, a faint rumble of thunder rolled, low and distant, but it didn't feel like an ordinary summer storm. No, this was something different. The skies overhead had begun to shift. The deep blue of the heavens was fading into an ominous greenish-gray, a color too unnatural to ignore. It was the kind of green that made people stop in their tracks, made them look up with that inexplicable sense of dread, a sense that the world was about to change in a way they couldn't control. The streets were quiet now. People had paused, as if sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The very earth beneath their feet seemed to hum with tension, and the air felt electric, like the first spark of a match just before it ignites. The hairs on the back of their necks stood on end. They couldn't explain it, but they knew something was coming. And it was big. It wasn't just the colors of the sky that spoke of impending danger. The wind had begun to pick up, but not in the usual way. This wind felt heavier. It moved with purpose, as if it had a mind of its own. The trees in the distance were swaying, their branches bending under the pressure, but there was no sign of rain. Not yet. The clouds above had darkened further, swirling in unnatural spirals, as though they were being drawn into a vortex. In the distance, the sound of a freight train began to grow louder, a low, almost inaudible hum at first, but it grew quickly, closer and closer. The roar of it echoed in the distance, sending a shiver through the air. It wasn't the rumble of thunder. It was something far worse. People stepped outside, drawn to the horizon, their eyes locked on the unnatural clouds that were now churning above them. The sky, that once peaceful blue, was now a swirling maelstrom of green and black. It was as if nature itself was about to tear open, and they were standing on the edge, waiting to see if they would be swallowed whole. This was no ordinary storm. This was something far worse, a force of nature that had the power to change their lives forever. They didn't know it yet, but the storm was already on its way, and it wouldn't stop until it had taken everything. The scene is set, and the atmosphere has thickened. The characters are unaware of the catastrophic event that is about to unfold, but they feel it in the air. This builds the sensory hook, letting the audience know that something monumental is coming without revealing too much yet. It was just another ordinary afternoon in Parkersburg. The streets bustled with the quiet rhythm of daily life. Families coming and going, children riding bikes, and neighbors greeting each other with friendly waves. The town, nestled in the heart of the Midwest, was a place where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at a pace that felt like it could never be interrupted. The kind of town where doors were left unlocked, and good mornings were exchanged like a cherished ritual. In one corner of the town, the Parkersburg Cafe was buzzing with its usual lunch crowd. A few farmers in denim overalls sat at the counter, swapping stories about the crops and the weather. A group of teenagers sat at a booth, laughing over shared fries and soda, the easy, carefree conversations of youth filling the air. The familiar hum of conversation mixed with the clinking of silverware and the sizzle of the grill in the kitchen. It was a picture of small-town life, simple and unassuming. A few blocks away, at the local school, children were finishing up their afternoon lessons, their voices echoing down the hallways as they eagerly awaited the bell that would send them home for the day. The sun was still high, the warmth of late spring seeping through the windows, bringing with it the promise of summer just around the corner. In the homes, people were going about their daily routines, unaware of the forces gathering on the horizon. A mother in a modest kitchen stirred a pot of soup, the smell of garlic and onions filling the air as her young son ran around the house, his laughter a pleasant background to the quiet hum of domestic life. Nearby, an elderly man sat on his porch, his dog at his feet, watching the street with quiet contemplation. It was peaceful peaceful in a way that only small towns can be. The kind of peace that feels permanent, like nothing could ever disrupt it. But in the distance, something was stirring, a change in the wind, a flicker of something that no one could yet comprehend. The town, tucked away in its sheltered little corner of the world, was about to face an unimaginable terror. But for now, there were no signs, no obvious hints that anything was wrong. The world seemed to be going on, just as it always had. Life in Parkersburg was quiet and predictable. People took comfort in their routines. They celebrated the mundane, the little moments that made up their days. The children would go home to their parents. The farmers would tend to their crops. The cafe would serve another round of coffee to the regulars. There were no grand expectations, just the steady rhythm of normal life. Yet, as the afternoon stretched on, a faint rumble in the distance hinted that this calmness was about to shatter. But at that moment, no one paid any mind. It was, after all, just another spring thunderstorm, nothing out of the ordinary. For now, Parkersburg was like any other small town across America, a place where life was simple, where you could count on the sun rising and setting in the same way every day. No one knew that, in a matter of hours, everything would change forever. The sense of normalcy is established, showing how life in Parkersburg is calm and peaceful, almost idyllic. The contrast between this ordinary day and the catastrophe that's about to strike is crucial to emphasize the severity of the upcoming disaster. The first sign of change came quietly, almost imperceptibly. A shift in the air, a subtle change that only those who were paying close attention could sense. The temperature, which had been uncomfortably hot, dropped suddenly, as if someone had flipped a switch. People paused for a moment, squinting against the abrupt chill, glancing up at the sky as if searching for an explanation. The wind, once calm, began to stir restlessly, a whisper at first, but soon it was a low, thrumming hum that vibrated through the streets. At the Parkersburg Cafe, the hum was felt more than heard. A man at the counter looked up from his newspaper, his brow furrowing as the overhead fan slowed to a near stop. The bell above the door jingled faintly as a breeze blew in, but it wasn't a refreshing gust of spring air. It felt wrong, too cold, too sudden. The elderly man on the porch felt it too, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling with an uneasy sense of foreboding. Then came the sky. It wasn't a gradual transition. One moment, the sky was a peaceful blue, and the next, it had turned an unsettling shade of green. A murky, sickly green, the kind that sent a chill down your spine. The air seemed to hold its breath as the storm clouds swirled, gathering momentum in a way that felt alive. Inside the school, the bell rang to release the students, but even the children, running with excitement toward the doors, seemed to sense the shift. Their chatter slowed, replaced by the unease that rippled through the crowd. Some of the older kids stopped on their way out, glancing nervously at the darkening sky. It was then that the warning sirens began to wail, their long, drawn-out tone cutting through the quiet like a knife. The sound was immediate, shocking, and people froze. The sound, once so familiar during drills, now held an urgency that none could ignore. A sharp contrast to the usual late afternoon sounds, it was a signal, a cry for attention that demanded action. But not everyone moved. At the cafe, the usual chatter was interrupted by the distant shriek of the sirens. A few heads turned, glances exchanged, but most of the patrons remained seated. It was just a drill, or so they thought. A man in his 40s waved it off, chuckling as he pushed back his chair. "It's just a test, folks," he said, a half-hearted attempt at reassurance. He turned back to his coffee, but the unease lingered. Others weren't so certain. A mother who had been at the park with her children turned her head as the siren sounded. She looked up at the sky, her stomach tightening. It wasn't the first time the sirens had blared, but this time it felt different. She grabbed her children by the hands, ushering them toward the nearest shelter, her pulse quickening with a growing sense of panic. The wind, now picking up, whistled as it cut through the trees, making them bend under its pressure. In the distance, far off to the east, a tornado had already begun to form, its funnel cloud twisting ominously toward the ground. But at this point, no one could see it yet. All they knew was that the sky had darkened in a way that felt unnatural. And now the sirens were blaring, sending a ripple of panic through the town. Some people still hesitated. It was hard to believe that something so destructive could really be on its way. The news had been warning of bad weather all week, but it was always just another storm. But this was different. It was becoming too real, too fast. And with each passing moment, the sense of dread grew stronger. The tornado would not wait. The signs were there, but many were still unsure. And for some, it would be too late by the time they realized that the warning wasn't a false alarm. The tension starts to build as people become more aware of the danger, but there's still uncertainty. Some ignore the warning, others react. This sets up the contrast between those who heed the signs and those who dismiss them. It happened faster than anyone could have imagined. 1 minute, the town of Parkersburg was caught in the throes of its usual quiet afternoon, and the next, the world seemed to explode into chaos. The first thing people noticed was the roar. It started low, like the sound of distant thunder, so far off that it seemed almost unreal. But then, with a terrifying intensity, it grew louder, swelling into a deafening crescendo. The sky turned an even deeper shade of green, and in the distance, a black mass began to twist and turn like an angry beast waking up from a long slumber. The tornado was no longer a possibility. It was a reality, and it was coming straight for them. For those in the streets, it was a split-second decision. Some ran, screaming for cover, while others froze, staring up at the terrifying funnel cloud that now hung low in the sky. It was no longer a drill. The sirens had stopped, replaced by the deafening roar of the storm itself. A man in the middle of Main Street looked up and saw the darkness beginning to twist and writhe in the air above him. His heart pounded in his chest as a sinking feeling overtook him. It was too late to run now. He turned toward the nearest building and bolted for the safety of its shelter, but his legs felt like lead. The wind had picked up, and it was no longer a gentle breeze. It was a violent, howling force that pushed against him with every step. The ground beneath his feet began to shake as though the earth itself was coming alive. The sound of the tornado's roar grew louder, and a feeling of sheer panic began to settle in. Meanwhile, in the Parkersburg cafe, chaos erupted. The once quiet room filled with screams and the frantic sounds of chairs scraping against the floor. People rushed to the door, some fumbling for their keys, others unsure of where to go or what to do. The server, a young woman with wide eyes, shouted for everyone to get to the basement, but the door had already been blocked by a panicked crowd trying to escape. It was too late. The tornado was almost upon them. The wind outside was now so fierce that it shook the very walls of the cafe. The windows rattled violently, and the light fixtures flickered as though the building itself was being torn apart. The smell of metal and earth mixed with the acrid scent of fear and panic. Then, a loud crash, glass shattering as the first pieces of debris began to fly through the air, tearing at the structure like 1,000 tiny daggers. The ground beneath their feet trembled, as though the world was shifting beneath them. In a house just a few blocks away, a mother huddled with her children in the basement. They had heard the sirens, felt the shift in the air, and she had quickly moved them to the safest place she knew. The sound of the tornado's fury grew louder and louder until it was almost unbearable. The walls shook with such force that she had to hold her children close to keep them from being thrown about. Her heart raced as she whispered calming words, though she wasn't sure she believed them herself. She could hear the howl of the wind outside, followed by the sickening sound of something large crashing against the house. Her instincts told her to hold on, to stay put, but fear gnawed at her. Could they survive this? Could the house withstand it? The tornado, now fully unleashed, tore through the town. It was an EF5, the most powerful type of tornado, capable of winds exceeding 200 miles per hour. It was a living nightmare that no one could have predicted, its rage unstoppable, its power unimaginable. In the distance, the first buildings began to crumble. A local grocery store that had stood for decades was ripped apart in seconds, its roof peeled away like the skin of an orange. Trees were uprooted, thrown aside like toys. Cars, once parked neatly in driveways, were lifted from the ground and tossed through the air like pieces of paper. And all the while, the tornado's roar continued, deafening and relentless. The sky seemed to crack open, and rain began to pour in sheets, but it was no longer a gentle summer storm. It was a torrential downpour of destruction. The debris swirled around them, and in those terrifying moments, there was no way to know who was safe and who wasn't. But one thing was certain. The town of Parkersburg would never be the same again. The tornado has touched down, and the full chaos begins. People are scrambling, unsure of what to do as their world unravels around them. The tension peaks here as buildings are destroyed and the town faces total devastation. The tornado was no longer a distant threat. It had become an unstoppable force of nature, a howling beast that tore through Parkersburg with a vengeance. Every second felt like an eternity as the sound of its fury drowned out all other noise. The screeching of metal, the splintering of wood, the crumbling of concrete. It was a deafening roar that seemed to come from every direction, shaking the earth beneath their feet and rattling their very bones. The town, once so peaceful, was now a war zone. Homes that had stood for generations were reduced to splinters and rubble in an instant. Roofs were torn away, walls collapsed, and the very foundations of the buildings seemed to tremble under the tornado's violent grip. It wasn't just the buildings that were destroyed. The very landscape was being transformed. Trees were uprooted like weeds, their trunks snapped like twigs. Cars, once shiny and parked neatly along the streets, were now crumpled heaps of metal, tossed aside as if they weighed nothing. The sound of the tornado's roar was punctuated by the shriek of debris as it was lifted into the air, swirling around in a terrifying dance of destruction. People who had been caught outside had no place to run. There was no shelter, no safety. A man running for cover was thrown against a brick wall by the sheer force of the wind. His body crumpled to the ground, unable to shield himself from the overwhelming power of the storm. His cries for help were lost to the roar of the tornado, as if the storm itself had swallowed him whole. Inside homes, the destruction was no less brutal. A mother, clutching her children in the basement, could hear the walls groan under the pressure of the storm. The very foundation of her house felt as though it was being ripped apart. Every crash, every scream of the wind, sent shock waves of fear through her. Her children huddled closer to her, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. She could feel her heart racing, each thump reminding her how close they were to losing everything. For the people who had taken shelter in the local church, the destruction felt surreal. The storm had ripped off the roof in a matter of seconds, and now the wind howled through the broken structure, tearing at the pews and the stained glass windows. The cries of people in the shelter mingled with the roar of the storm, their desperation growing as they realized the full scale of the disaster. The priest, standing at the front of the church, tried to calm the frightened congregation, but even his voice seemed small in the face of the storm's might. The devastation was now total. Parkersburg, a town that had once felt so alive with community and promise, had been reduced to a wasteland. The streets, once bustling with life, were now littered with debris. The pavement was cracked and twisted, the buildings that had defined the town were gone, and the air was thick with dust and smoke from the fires that had broken out in the wake of the destruction. And then, as quickly as it had come, the tornado was gone. The roar faded into the distance, leaving behind an eerie silence that seemed even more terrifying than the storm itself. The wind, once so violent, had calmed to a soft, mournful whisper. The sky, still heavy with clouds, hung over the town like a shroud. But the destruction it left in its wake was unimaginable. Survivors stumbled out from their shelters, dazed, their eyes wide with disbelief. What had just happened? How had this all gone so wrong? But even in their shock, they knew everything had changed. Parkersburg would never be the same again. The peak of the tornado's destruction is vividly depicted highlighting the emotional and physical toll of the storm on the town and its people. This is the height of the disaster, where the devastation is overwhelming and the survivors are left to grapple with the enormity of the situation. In the aftermath of the storm, the first thing that struck the survivors was the silence. It wasn't a peaceful kind of quiet, but a hollow, oppressive silence that hung heavy over the town, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The deafening roar of the tornado had faded, but the echoes of its destruction lingered in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. It was a silence that spoke of loss, of grief, and of an unimaginable terror that no one could have prepared for. Sarah, a young mother, had been at the park with her 2 children when the storm hit. The tornado's approach had been swift, but the warning signs were clear. The sky had turned green, the wind picked up, and the sirens wailed with an urgency that was impossible to ignore. She grabbed her kids and ran, heart pounding in her chest, her legs feeling like they were made of lead. They made it to the basement of a nearby building, just in time. As the storm raged above them, Sarah clutched her children close, whispering reassurances that she didn't believe herself. The air smelled of dust and fear, and the house around them groaned and creaked under the pressure. For what felt like an eternity, they held on, not knowing if they would make it out alive. When the storm passed, Sarah emerged from the basement, her heart sinking as she looked around. The world she had known just hours before was gone. Her house was nothing but rubble, her neighborhood reduced to splinters. But it wasn't just the destruction that broke her. It was the fear in her children's eyes, the look of confusion and terror that she couldn't erase. They were safe, physically, but emotionally they were shattered. How do you explain something like this to a child? Elsewhere in the town, Robert, a lifelong resident, stood in the ruins of what had once been his home. He had lived in Parkersburg all his life, raised his children here, and watched the town grow. Now, all that was left was debris and dust. The wind had carried away everything, his home, his memories, his belongings. But it wasn't the material things that haunted him. It was the fact that he hadn't been able to do anything to stop the storm. He had seen it coming, knew it was bad, but he hadn't acted quickly enough. He hadn't gotten his family to safety in time. His wife, who had been in the kitchen when the tornado hit, was now missing. He searched through the debris with shaking hands, calling her name, his voice hoarse with desperation. His mind raced with the questions that had no answers. Was she alive? Was she trapped? The moment he found her, buried under the rubble, it was as if the world had stopped. He dug through the debris with frantic hands, his tears mixing with the dirt and dust. When he finally pulled her out, her lifeless body in his arms, the weight of the loss hit him like a ton of bricks. All he could do was hold her close, feeling the weight of everything he had lost. In that moment, he realized that no amount of rebuilding could ever replace what he had lost. No house, no material thing could bring her back. But amidst the overwhelming sorrow, there were other stories of survival, stories that shone a faint light through the darkness. A group of strangers, brought together by the storm, helped each other out of the wreckage. Some were neighbors, others had been strangers just hours before, but now they were bound by a shared experience, a bond forged in the deepest kind of crisis. In the local hospital, the staff worked tirelessly to treat the wounded. The nurses, many of them shaken by the destruction, moved quickly between rooms, administering care and offering words of comfort to those who had lost everything. One nurse, Emma, had been on shift when the storm hit. She had felt the hospital tremble as the tornado's winds whipped around the building. But she didn't leave. She stayed, treating the injured, doing everything she could to keep the patients stable. When the storm passed, she found herself caring for not only the injured, but also the emotional wreckage of the town. Many of the survivors were just as broken inside as they were on the outside, and Emma's quiet presence became a source of strength. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew that, at that moment, the only thing she could give was her compassion. One survivor, a teenager named Mia, had been caught in the middle of the storm while walking home from school. She had been thrown across a field by the tornado's violent winds, and when she awoke, she found herself alone, lying in the dirt. Covered in bruises and scratches, She dragged herself to her feet, her mind racing with confusion and panic. She had no idea where her family was, or if they were even alive. But somehow, despite the pain, Mia pushed forward. She stumbled through the wreckage, calling out for her parents, refusing to give up, even when every step felt like it would be her last. When she finally found her family, battered and bruised, but alive, the relief that washed over her was overwhelming. It was the first taste of hope they had felt since the tornado hit. And it was the first glimpse of the resilience that would carry them all through the long road ahead. In the weeks that followed, the town of Parkersburg began to pick up the pieces. The destruction was nearly total, but the human spirit, as it always does, began to rebuild. People who had never met before helped each other, sharing what little they had. There was an overwhelming sense of unity, of shared loss and survival. Parkersburg would never be the same, but neither would the people who had lived through it. They had faced the worst of nature's fury and emerged with something far stronger than they had before, an unbreakable bond. This section focuses on the deeply human stories of loss, survival, and the emotional toll of the disaster. It brings the personal experiences of survivors to the forefront, emphasizing the emotional journey and the long road to recovery. As the tornado tore through Parkersburg, its raw power left a trail of destruction that no one could have fully prepared for. But behind the chaos and the wreckage, there was a science, a cold, precise set of forces that gave the tornado its strength and intensity. Understanding how these forces worked can offer insight into the sheer violence of the storm that ripped through the town. The tornado that struck Parkersburg was classified as an EF5 on the Fujita scale, the highest level of intensity. To put it into perspective, EF5 tornadoes are capable of producing wind speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour. These winds are strong enough to flatten well-built homes, pick up vehicles, and hurl debris for miles. The EF scale ranges from EF0, weakest, to EF5, strongest, with each level based on the observed damage caused by the tornado. The science behind tornado formation begins with the interaction of two vastly different air masses. In the case of Parkersburg, the storm's formation began with a clash of warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico and cooler, dry air from the north. As these air masses collided, they created an environment ripe for severe weather. When warm, moist air rises quickly, it creates an area of low pressure, while the cooler air sinks, creating high pressure. This difference in pressure causes air to rotate, creating a supercell, a rotating thunderstorm capable of producing a tornado. But not all supercells produce tornadoes. What makes one supercell more likely to produce a tornado than another is the presence of wind shear, a change in wind speed and direction with height. When wind shear is strong enough, it can create horizontal spinning columns of air. These columns, when tilted upward by the strong updrafts of the storm, can form tornadoes. The tornado that hit Parkersburg likely formed as a result of a combination of wind shear and instability in the atmosphere. The winds at the surface were strong, but at higher altitudes, they were even stronger, causing a rapid rotation of the air. Once the rotation was tightly organized and vertical, the tornado touched down, pulling debris into its swirling funnel and intensifying as it moved across the landscape. The devastation wrought by the tornado was a direct result of these extreme wind speeds. EF5 tornadoes, like the one that struck Parkersburg, have winds that are strong enough to strip entire buildings down to their foundations. These tornadoes don't just destroy, they annihilate. They can uproot trees, toss cars, and reduce brick houses to mere piles of rubble. The winds are so intense that they can rip the bark off trees, leaving them stripped bare. They can flatten fields of crops in seconds, turning a vibrant, thriving landscape into a barren wasteland. And in the case of Parkersburg, the tornado did just that. It took a thriving town and reduced it to ruin in a matter of minutes. The tornado's intensity can also be measured by the types of damage it causes. EF5 tornadoes are capable of causing incredible damage, completely destroying even the most sturdy of buildings. This is why Parkersburg, a town that seemed so invulnerable, just hours before, was now unrecognizable. Houses that had stood for decades were reduced to dust, and entire neighborhoods were erased. The scale of the damage was a direct reflection of the tornado's violent winds. But it's not just about wind speed. The size of the tornado also plays a significant role in its destructive power. Tornadoes come in all shapes and sizes, and while some may be narrow and short-lived, others can stretch for miles, leaving an extended path of destruction. The Parkersburg tornado, as an EF5, was likely an exceptionally large tornado with a wide base and a long path of devastation. In addition to wind speed and size, the storm's intensity was also influenced by the conditions in the atmosphere. When conditions are highly unstable, with the right combination of temperature, moisture, and wind, the resulting storm can be much more powerful. In Parkersburg's case, the storm had all the right ingredients: ample moisture, extreme instability, and strong wind shear, making it a prime candidate for a catastrophic tornado. The storm's rapid development also contributed to its destructive power. Tornadoes that form quickly are often harder to track and predict. Forecasters can give a general warning about potential tornado activity, but when a storm intensifies rapidly, like the one over Parkersburg, the warning time is much shorter. This means that fewer people have time to seek shelter, and the storm can catch many off guard. In essence, the tornado that hit Parkersburg was the result of a perfect storm of atmospheric conditions, a combination of warm, moist air, cool, dry air, and wind shear that created a supercell capable of producing a devastating EF5 tornado. Once the tornado touched down, its violent winds, immense size, and rapid intensification created a path of destruction that would be felt for years to come. This section delves into the meteorological factors that led to the formation of the tornado, explaining the science behind the disaster. By breaking down the tornado's development and behavior, the audience gains a deeper understanding of the forces at play and the scale of the destruction. When the tornado finally passed, it left behind a scene of devastation unlike anything anyone in Parkersburg had ever imagined. The town, once bustling with the hum of daily life, was now a wasteland. The air was thick with dust and debris, a heavy, acrid smell that made it hard to breathe. The sky, still dark and brooding, hung low over the ruins, casting a pall over the land. The storm had taken everything in its path, but it hadn't taken the spirit of the people. The first responders arrived within minutes, though it felt like an eternity. The police, firefighters, and emergency medical teams pushed their way into the shattered streets, their vehicles barely able to navigate the twisted remains of what had once been roads. They moved quickly, but even their well-trained hands trembled as they processed the scale of the disaster. This wasn't a typical rescue mission. This was something far worse, something they had only seen in the worst-case scenarios, something no one had been prepared for. The emergency sirens still wailed in the distance, a constant reminder that the situation was far from over. But amid the chaos, the first responders began their work. Search and rescue teams combed through the rubble, sifting through the debris in search of survivors. Every overturned car, every collapsed building felt like a grave, but still they pressed on. Every life saved was a victory in a day that had already claimed so much. At the local hospital, the staff worked tirelessly to treat the injured. The emergency room was a blur of activity. Doctors and nurses moved quickly from patient to patient, their faces drawn with exhaustion and shock. The injured were coming in faster than they could treat them, and many were in critical condition. It was a race against time, and in those early hours, no one could afford to stop. The hospital, which had once been a place of healing, had become a battlefield. In the streets, the survivors wandered in a daze, unsure of where to go or what to do. They stood in small groups, speaking in hushed voices, some staring blankly at the destruction, others crying, holding onto each other for support. Families searched for loved ones, calling out their names, but the sounds of the disaster drowned their voices. The fear and uncertainty were palpable in the air. For many, it was as if their world had ceased to exist. Sarah, the mother who had sheltered in the basement with her children, stood in the wreckage of her home, her hands shaking as she looked around. Her house was gone, reduced to a pile of rubble. The things that once defined her life, the family photos, the worn furniture, the kitchen where she had cooked for years, were now buried beneath debris. The only thing left were the memories, the ones that seemed to slip through her fingers like sand. Her children, though physically safe, were visibly shaken. They clung to her, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. They didn't fully understand what had happened, but they knew their world had changed forever. Sarah wrapped her arms around them, trying to hold it together for their sake, but deep down, she felt the weight of the loss. She had survived, but she had lost so much. And now, the hardest part, figuring out how to move forward, was about to begin. Nearby, Robert, the man who had lost his wife in the storm, was still in shock. His hands trembled as he searched through the rubble, calling out her name, desperate for a sign. He had found her, but she was gone. The grief was suffocating, pressing in on him like the storm itself. The reality of his loss hit him harder with each passing minute. How could he go on without her? How could he face the future knowing she wouldn't be there? The days that followed were a blur of recovery and mourning. Parkersburg was a town that had once thrived on its sense of community, and in the aftermath of the tornado, that community would prove to be its greatest strength. Neighbors who had once been strangers helped each other sift through the wreckage. They shared what little food and water they had. They offered comfort, their words simple but powerful. We'll rebuild. Together. But the physical damage was only part of the toll the tornado had taken. The emotional scars would last far longer. People were not only dealing with the loss of homes and belongings, but also with the trauma of what they had experienced. The sounds of the tornado's roar, the sight of the destruction, the fear of losing loved ones. These things would stay with them long after the debris was cleared. The psychological toll of such a catastrophic event couldn't be measured in mere statistics. It was something deeper, something that would require months, even years of healing. And yet, amid the destruction and despair, there was a glimmer of hope. The town of Parkersburg was broken, but it was not defeated. The people who had survived the storm were determined to rebuild. It would take time, it would take effort, and it would take everything they had, but they would do it together. The first responders, the volunteers, the residents, everyone came together. They didn't have much, but they had each other. And that, in the face of such overwhelming loss, was enough. This section portrays the immediate aftermath, focusing on the first few hours after the tornado passes. The survivors are in shock. The first responders are working tirelessly, and the emotional toll of the disaster begins to surface. The town begins to pull together, despite the overwhelming devastation. In the weeks and months following the devastation of Parkersburg, the true scale of the disaster began to sink in. While the initial shock and chaos had subsided, the long-term effects were only beginning to unfold. The town had been reduced to rubble, but its people were far from broken. However, rebuilding, both physically and emotionally, was a much slower, more painful process than anyone had anticipated. The first step was clearing the debris. It was a monumental task. Miles of twisted metal, shattered glass, splintered wood, and personal belongings that had been strewn across the town by the tornado's ferocious winds. The streets, once lined with homes and businesses, were now nothing but vast fields of destruction. Volunteers poured in from neighboring towns, states, even countries. They arrived in droves, driven by compassion, ready to help the survivors put their lives back together. But as the piles of debris slowly began to shrink, it became clear that the work of rebuilding would take years. The town's infrastructure, roads, power lines, water systems, had been obliterated, and rebuilding it would require not only labor, but significant resources. Many families had lost everything: their homes, their cars, their belongings. And yet, amid this overwhelming loss, there was a quiet sense of determination. They were survivors, and they were not going to let the storm take away their future. Sarah, who had lost her home and nearly everything she held dear, found herself in a temporary shelter. The walls were bare, the floors cold, but it was a roof over her head. She spent her days sorting through what little remained of her life. Photos, keepsakes, anything that might bring some semblance of comfort. Her children had returned to school, though their laughter was quieter now, their innocence forever altered by the violence they had witnessed. Sarah tried to reassure them that life would get back to normal, but she knew better. Normal was gone. She struggled, not just with the loss of her material possessions, but with the overwhelming grief of the past weeks. The trauma of the tornado, the sounds of the wind, the moment when she had thought she might lose her children, all of that was still fresh in her mind. She tried to stay strong for them, but there were days when the weight of it all felt too much to bear. Still, she pushed forward, knowing that her children needed her. They all needed each other. Robert, on the other hand, had been lost in his grief. His wife was gone, and he couldn't shake the feeling that part of him had died along with her. The rubble of his home had been cleared, but it felt like a piece of his heart had been buried in that same wreckage. He spent his days rebuilding, but it was a mechanical, lifeless process. He didn't care about the walls, the roof, or the floor. What he wanted, what he could never have, was her. He spent hours in the quiet of his broken house, staring at the space where she used to be, where they had spent so many years together. And yet, as time wore on, he found himself reaching out to others, hearing their stories, connecting with them in ways he hadn't before. He wasn't alone in his grief. The entire town was mourning together, and, in their shared sorrow, they began to find small moments of healing. Slowly, he started to realize that rebuilding wasn't just about houses and roads. It was about people, about memories, and about finding a way to carry on. In the hospital, Emma, the nurse who had worked tirelessly to treat the injured, found herself dealing with the psychological aftermath of the disaster. While the wounds of the body could be treated with medicine, the scars left on the mind were far more difficult to heal. Many of the patients she had treated had lost everything, and their trauma was evident in their eyes. Some of them were physically recovering, but emotionally, they were still trapped in the storm. Emma herself was struggling. The exhaustion from the long hours of work weighed heavily on her. But what hurt the most was the sense of helplessness. There were so many people to help, so many stories of loss, and there were only so many hours in the day. She often found herself wondering how long it would take for the town to heal. How long would it take for the survivors to rebuild not just their homes, but their lives? But even in the face of this despair, there was an undeniable sense of unity. The town of Parkersburg, though broken, was coming together. Neighbors helped neighbors. Volunteers continued to pour in from across the country. The town had lost its physical identity, but the heart of Parkersburg, its people, remained strong. They leaned on each other, helping to rebuild not just their homes, but their sense of community. As the months went on, some semblance of normalcy began to return. The streets were being repaved, homes were being rebuilt, and businesses started to reopen. But it wasn't just the physical structures that were being repaired. The people of Parkersburg, scarred but resilient, began to heal. The wounds of the tornado were deep, but with each passing day, they found new ways to cope. They didn't forget what they had lost, but they learned how to live with it, how to move forward despite the scars. In time, Parkersburg would rebuild, physically and emotionally, but the people would never forget. They had faced the worst, but they had emerged stronger, more united than ever before. The town would never be the same, but in many ways, it was better. It was a place where the community wasn't just a collection of houses and buildings. It was a collection of souls who had endured the impossible together. This section explores the long-term emotional and practical impact of the tornado on the town of Parkersburg. It focuses on the survivors' journey through grief, rebuilding, and finding hope amidst the ruins. It's a reminder that while physical destruction can be rebuilt, the emotional scars take much longer to heal. As years passed, the town of Parkersburg began to heal. The physical scars left by the EF5 tornado that devastated it may have slowly faded. Streets were rebuilt, homes restored, and businesses reopened, but the emotional toll lingered. The memories of that fateful day were still fresh for many, but over time, the resilience of the people began to shine through. The community, stronger than ever, had learned to rebuild not just their homes, but their lives. And from this rebirth, new lessons were born. Lessons about preparedness, about the importance of community, and about how to face the future with greater knowledge and strength.